And we're back again. Alright, we needed to stuff this into our configuration, but at the moment we don't have an actual reference for it. So, let's create one. Server profile config, we'll just call this config equals new server profile config. And of course it doesn't know this yet, so we'll import the namespace. There we go. And right here we now have the Minecraft path and Minecraft jar, but since we're getting the full file name here, we kind of need to split it first. So to do that, we will go like this: config.minecraftPath equals dialog.filename.substring, since it's a string, start at the beginning and look for the last index of a backslash. And I'd like to keep the trailing backslash just to make it easier, so we'll add one. And for the jar, we need to grab from the trailing the last backslash to the end of the string. So we'll substring this, looking for the last index of a backslash plus 1, because we need to start at the first letter of the file name, and then subtract this from the length of the file name. There we go. We have now stuffed the path to where the server resides into the path, and we've stuffed the actual jar file name into our jar property of the config. And here we could then potentially save the changes. Except we don't have an option to do that yet. Dang it! Okay, let's go fix that, shall we? See, these are currently private. We could also no, actually let's just do the save. Let's do that here. Methods, public void save. Since this takes care of our configuration path, we don't particularly need to do much here, except at some point maybe add in a check whether something has changed. If changes exist, then do the save, otherwise skip it. For now, we'll just do it regardless. Now, one of the annoying things of messing about with modded Minecraft is that when you're doing stuff like changing a few things in configuration files, they always change constantly. By putting in a check internally that figures out when something has changed and only saving when changes actually occur, you don't end up getting a config file that is consistently rewritten. There is actually no need to rewrite a config file unless changes have actually been made to it. So that's something we'll implement later. We also need to place a call to loading of the configuration, and we might as well attempt to do that here during the class instantiation. because, well, reasons. Anyway, we now have a save method, so we'll call that. That effectively saves the changes to disk, so we have those available next time we start up. Okay. Let's go grab a quick run. Oops. We have a bug. Well, this is exactly what can happen. We are attempting to grab part of a string past the end of the string itself, and that should actually not occur here. Let's see. Oh, I derped. I put a plus in there where it was supposed to be a minus. There we go. Problem solved. Okay, and just to verify, go in here and see if we actually did get, and we didn't. Interesting. And why didn't we get that? That's probably because I referenced the wrong environment thingamajig. So let's put a breakpoint here so we can check it. Yeah, it points to the roaming folder of the app data. So let's change the environment reference up in our initialize config path, which means this one is wrong. So that would then be the common application data instead. So let's go with that and see what happens. And now we should have in program data a Minecraft server launcher. But there's nothing in there just yet. The reason there isn't anything in there just yet is, of course, because we haven't written the actual configuration file. Now, one thing that the current setup does is that it ahead of time creates the folder, but we could end up having an empty folder if somebody decides against actually using this application, which would just leave an empty folder there. So we could change the setup to only create the folder if it doesn't exist when we write the config file the very first time. It's again one of those personal preference things, but for now let's just leave it as is. Let's see, D drive, Minecraft server, vanilla, the jar. Boom. Now it's selected and it instantly created the server profile CFG, and let's see what's in it. Holy smokes, it actually did create a full setup for us, except we didn't assign any kind of memory size to it. We didn't do that because we actually don't exactly want it to save whenever the open button is used. We want it to save whenever the save button has been clicked. So for the sake of keeping things clean, let's delete this and go back to our project. Now we used the open open button to pop a open file dialog to go find the jar file, and then place the call to the save configuration. We'll get rid of that. Instead, we will do a couple of checks down here. Now, since we want the text box to contain the full path and file name of the server jar, we'll do a quick check down here in the Save button to figure out whether a valid path and file name has actually been entered into the text box or selected via the Open button, effectively allowing the user to either enter the path and the file name or simply use the Open button, which most people will probably do anyway. But we still need to check that it's an actual valid file path name. So let's grab it from the text box. Just as a force of habit, remove any spaces that might be there. I know that it's strictly not needed, however, if you do append a space at the end of the file name, you could get some strange things happening. Alright, first of all, let's see if there actually is something in this thing. If there is, then, and if there isn't, then we'll throw an error message to the user. Okay, there's something in there. Let's see if it actually exists. So we'll grab the file from the system IO namespace. Exists. Does this actually exist as a file? Now, if it does, then we can safely assume that this is a potentially valid file reference. So we will grab this from up here and move it down here instead, and only update the actual config whenever the Save button is clicked. And since we don't have the dialog now, but instead have a file path name variable, we will simply use that instead. So change these to reference the file path name string variable. There we go. And it's now written in. One more thing that we also need to do in the Save button is to grab whatever number is in here at the moment. So we'll do that. Config.memory size, grab the numeric up down. We should actually rename this at some point. Value. And here we need to note that this is actually set up as a decimal. So to properly convert this into the int that we expect, we just cast it as an int instead. There we go. And this is not a method, this is a property. There we go. Now we can properly save our changes. Job done. One more thing that we could do here is add in some extra UI handling to enable and disable the Save button according to what's going on with this text box and this up-down box. So let's do that quick. In the shown, we will start off by disabling the Save button. Enabled, set that to false. There we go. If the text box changes or the numeric up-down changes, we kind of need to hook those events. So default event for the text box is text changed, and the default event for a numeric up-down is value changed. Now, these events occur if something within this particular control changes. So we can easily use these to figure out whether we need to re-enable the Save button or not. Since these are control events, we will move them up here. There we go. And since this one changes, we can enable the Save button and we can do exactly the same down here. There we go. If this, no, actually, we still need to do that. Now that we have saved, we will disable the save button. There we go. And here we'll throw them a message box stating that the path and file name of the Minecraft server jar that you have specified is not valid. Please check and try again. Thank you very much. Invalid Minecraft server jar. And then we'll put a button, OK, and we'll do an icon which we will put to blah blah blah. Message box contains a symbol consisting of an exclamation point in a triangle with a yellow background. Yeah, let's use that. There we go. And just to make things a little easier, we will put the focus on the text box. There we go. Okay. Next thing we need to do is to populate the text box with whatever path and jar was saved to the config file, as well as set up the numeric up-down with whatever memory value was selected previously. And that is something that we will do in the shown event. The reason for doing this is that this is a fairly secure place to do any of your UI updating, because at this point every single control is completely done and over with any kind of initialization that needs to be done before the actual graphical UI is being shown. All of that stuff is done and over with, and we can safely assume that all controls have properly settled, leaving us the perfect position to set up whatever we need just before it's being shown. So here we'll grab this and actually string temp equals no, hang on. We know that we have the Minecraft path and the Minecraft jar. They will contain a path and a jar name if one has been previously saved. So first let's check if there actually is a path in there. If this is greater than 0 and the jar length is greater than 0, then we'll put that in the text box config, and we should probably make sure that this one has a trailing backslash. The reason we need to check this is if somebody decides to open up the CFG file here and edit the text manually in the ini file, then we honestly don't know if there is a trailing backslash written into the ini file. Some people might leave it out, some will put it in. It's a matter of old habits and all that. So just for the sake of making sure, we'll grab the path, figure out whether the last character is an actual backslash or not. If it isn't, add it to it. There we go, and now we can put it up there. txt equals path plus config.minecraftjar. Done. The next bit we need to update is the memory configuration, but we will only do that if an actual path and jar have been previously configured and saved. So we'll grab the numeric up-down value, not validate value, equals config.memory size. There we go. In all other cases, we will force the numeric up-down value to reset back to its initial value, just to make sure. And finally, we will move the save button, disable, down to the bottom to make sure that our changes to the UI controls doesn't reset this back to true. It will actually do it, but since this is the last thing we do, it will force the button to be disabled, indicating no changes have been made. Let's see what happens. There we go. Path to Minecraft server, right here. Open it up. Let's set this to 1024 and save and see what happens. Boom. There we go. Quit. Run it again. And something went wrong. Okay. Now we need to figure out what. Let's check the config here. It's set up correctly. So something in our program somewhere doesn't react the way it's supposed to. Alright. That may actually be in here. Let's see. This would be the place that we need to check. So let's see what happens. The file name actually does point to the correct file, so that's not the issue. Let's see what it does here and go through the checks. Shut up. And we should get something, and we do. That would be because we didn't finish this one. So let's fix that quick, and that would be a call to parse ini. Let's get rid of this. Parse ini data. There we go. And the configuration was preloaded, and the button was disabled. Nice. So we now have options to that allow us to set up a profile for this particular Minecraft server, set some memory settings, and save those changes to disk so we can load them up the next time we want to run the server. Okay, now that we have a config, we can actually get into doing an attempt at running the server. So let's give that a shot. Let's get rid of these. Alright. Let's grab a container and stuff that in here. Here we go. And then we'll put a couple of buttons in here. Server control, whatever. There we go. Server control. Alright. Now I'm not too worried about let's get rid of this quick. I'm not too worried about this particular instance of my vanilla server. Just to be on the safe side, we'll do a quick archive of it in case we do something fatally wrong, so we can quickly restore it. There we go. Job done. And then let's see if we can actually start the thing. So we'll put a button here and rename that to start. And we'll do a stop. Now, what I'm about to do is something that you really shouldn't do to a Minecraft server. Well, actually, And we'll put the stop button in here. We can't actually do the code for it yet, but we'll get there. Alright, so here we need this, and we also need this at some point. We'll grab these and move them up to the control events, just like the other control events. Here we go. And then we will look into what can be done to actually start up the server. Now, I did some previous testing just to make sure that I knew exactly how to do things, and just for the sake of getting things done a little quicker, I'll pretty much grab this. Now, what this code does is that this sets up a new process, which is similar to doing a shell execute, except by doing it through a process, we can do two things. One thing is that we can more precisely specify the run conditions for this particular task, as well as grab the output that might come from it, and effectively keep reading whatever output that particular process might spew at us. Since we know that the Minecraft server will spew out all sorts of different console information, this would be the perfect setup for us, so we can correctly grab the output that the server throws at us for, say, logging purposes, or if we want to show an actual console of what's going on. For now, I'll just throw it in the debug. But it just allows us so much more freedom to properly configure the process that we are about to start up. So, for the sake of keeping all that process stuff separate, I'll do a separate region here called run server handling. There we go. Private void starts server. And we'll place a call for this down here. But before we actually do that, we need to check that we actually have a configured server. So let's ask our config class whether we have a path to a server, and whether we have a jar configured, and whether we have a memory size configured. If we do, start the server. There we go. And then we will go up here and grab the process configuration and then tweak it for all the other stuff that needs to be done. There we go. Now, this will block the thread that the main UI is running on until the process is done running. So it might be beneficial to at some point throw this in a different thread and then do some cross-thread handling of it. It's something we can do in the future. For now, we just want to get this actually working. So, what are we specifying? We are specifying that we would like to start the program called Java. Since we've installed Java on the computer, the installer at some point wrote in a reference to where Java resides, so shouldn't be a big issue calling that. Then we need to specify the arguments. Now, in our config, we have a property called memory size, which specifies the amount of memory we want to assign for this instance of Java. So let's grab that quick, which would be the config memory size, and we need to convert this into a string and set it up again over here. Fake that memory size to string. There we go. And then let's see. Specifying a jar, which would be the jar file name, which we have right here. And then we don't exactly want the UI to show up. This is something that we can put on optionally. For now, I think we will just do this and leave the UI up. That way we can go into the regular Minecraft UI, server UI, and shut it down and then see what happens. We don't want to use shell execute because we need the standard output from the Java instance redirected to us. We don't really want to create a window for it, and we also need to set the working directory. The working directory would be the Minecraft path that we have in the config, so we'll set that. There we go, and that's pretty much it. This is pretty much the same thing as creating individual variables for all this stuff and then setting up all the properties manually. It's just a quick notation way of doing it. We don't need the line count. Get rid of that. While this process has not finished streaming output, we'll grab the next line that comes from it, and then we will dump it in the debug right line. There we go. There we go, and this will continue running for as long as the Minecraft server itself is actually alive. This is a call to have our application wait for the actual process to finish and shut down. Again, do things the right way, and when we're done, dispose of it. Since we're trying to start the server here, we will do a button start enabled equals false, and we will re-enable it down here. There we go. Now, one thing that we could put in, just to be courteous, I guess, is that we could put in a application do events just to allow our main application to actually do some updates now and then. So just for the sake of argument, we'll do that. There we go. And that should pretty much be it. Let's see if this actually works. One thing that I actually do want to put in there before we start all this is, let's put some information down there first. Starting Minecraft server, and then right line, do an empty line there. Don't need this actually. Oh, we do need it. It's in the console thing, yes. Right. And finally, down here, Minecraft server stopped. There we go. Now, these line outputs will show up in the output window here. So let's see what happens. Start. Boom, there we go. Sometimes, and I'm not entirely sure, it will start up once with some exception handling console input. Not sure why this happens. I've seen it a couple of times, but it only happens the first time. So I'm not entirely sure why. But as we can see here, this is the actual console output that we have in our application. And since I removed the no GUI, we also have the output here. So it's now up and running. Since this is running, our application's main thread where the UI resides is currently frozen. And the way to circumvent that particular issue is, of course, to put this in a separate thread and have it run from there, and then do some cross-thread negotiation to communicate back and forth. Now, one interesting thing that we can do is, since we are now capable of logging the information that comes from the Minecraft server console, we could potentially look for this particular line. This is effectively the last output from the server's boot up sequence, which tells us it has now completed loading up. It has completed loading up the initial parts of the game world, and is effectively now ready to play the game. What could be interesting for us to do is at some point to go in and look for this particular line of information and tie that into a UI update that indicates on our UI that the server has now finished loading and is effectively ready to be used. It's something that we can do. For now though, let's shut this down, and as we can see, the console output from Java comes here and there. Stopping the server, stopping server, saving players, saving worlds, saving chunks for level blah 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 blah, stopping server. And this last line is this piece of code, which now correctly indicates to us in our debug output that we were in fact able to grab all of the output from the server console and effectively redirect it to our debug output. We could also save that in a separate log file, or keep it in a string array or a collection, or whatever we need this to be. In any case, we can actually start it up and shut it down again. So now that we have seen that it's actually running, let's put the no GUI back on and give it another spin. Now it will still be blocking our main thread, so this window will become unresponsive as soon as we start up the server. It's something that we will fix by moving all of this into a proper separate thread and leave that to handle the actual events that the server is producing by starting up. And we can even look into creating text parsers that looks for players joining and players leaving, which we could potentially update as part of the launch handler thingy. But for now, let's just start it up and see what happens. There we go. Interestingly enough, it actually happens again. Exception handling console input might be because I haven't redirected the input for it, not sure. In any case, The UI is sitting here. It's unresponsive, but we should be able to load into the world. So let's give that a try and see what happens. If this thing decides to stop, that is. Right. This client is modded. I completely forgot about that. Here we go. Robin. Very nice. And just to show you, here is the output. My ID and all that stuff shows up here. I don't care if anybody knows it. If stuff happens, stuff happens. In any case, we can see that it's correctly logging the information that's coming from the server, and I should be able to do this and it will shut down the server. And if we scroll down, we can see that it correctly stopped, saved, disconnected me, and quit running. Awesome. Alright, now that we got that working, we have an initial platform to do the to start up a server. We can configure the path for it. We can set up memory spinach, working directory, and actually launch the server, correctly log what's coming from it, and register that it's shut down. So from here, next step would probably be stuffing this into a separate class that can handle running the Minecraft server in a separate thread from our main UI, and then tie in some controls so we can tell this particular thread, hey, you need to shut down now, or show me the console, or whichever extra options we want to put in here. Now, if we want to, let's see if we can actually redirect standard input. Indeed we can. So let's put that on there and see if we still get that error that occurs. Now, if we are redirecting standard input, let's see if we can put something in here. Base priority, blah, 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 blah. Let's see what kind of output options we have. Session ID, standard input, standard output, blah, 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 blah. Threads, virtual, wait for, working set. Well, I'm pretty sure that we can put some stuff in here somewhere. Honestly, I haven't really messed about that much with redirecting the standard input. Sure, there's something in there that allows us to write something back to the Minecraft server, but we'll leave this as is for now. Actually, let's see if we'll disable this quick, just to see if it still derps up on the initial launch. It shouldn't. Nope, all done. Okay. Problem solved. Alright. Quit. There we go. let's see if we can migrate this into a separate class that handles the actual running of the Minecraft server, but leaves our main thread responsive. And then do some message tweaking back and forth. Okay. Da, 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 da. Let's name this server host, just because we can. There we go. Constructor, public, do this. There we go. And what I'm about to do, I know that there are heated arguments everywhere online, whether to do this one way, another way, or a third way. Again, this is something that's up to personal preference. In coding, there is no right way and no wrong way of accomplishing a goal set for a specific task. As long as you can accomplish the goal without your application ending up crashing, causing memory bloats or some kind of CPU overload, then you are pretty much free to do the code any way you see fit. Use the tools that you have available to you. Use whatever means and methods that you are used to. If you're in doubt, then Google is your friend. You can get tons of different examples on how people choose to accomplish a given task. Go look what other people do and learn from their code. There is no set way of doing anything in particular. Some of the things that I'm trying to convey here is best practice regarding certain elements of development, one of them being anything that has to do with file I/O, always make sure it's wrapped in try-catch, because you can never assume and you can never trust that a file exists or that a path exists or that they are even available to you. So make sure you always do that. When you organize your stuff, when you create arguments for methods, my advice is to try to keep the order of arguments according to how this particular thing is logically built up. So if you're, for example, specifying a path, file name, and some data for a save method, the logical way of doing this is grabbing the most important aspect, leading to the least important aspect. The most important aspect is first and foremost the drive letter. Second is the path reference, third is the file name, and fourth is the data. And you should prioritize your arguments accordingly. The same thing when you create methods for other things. Figure out what the most important thing is, or what the highest grouping of whatever reference you have. Grab that first and then add on the least important parts as the last arguments. But again, it's personal preference. This is just the way that I've done things for 30 years. So anyway, let's see. A server host, it needs to know the server that we are about to start up. It needs to be able to set a memory aside for the Java instance. It needs to know the jar, and so on and so forth. Now, this particular class that we are beginning to build now, will eventually be extended with a bunch of other things as well. See, one of the goals that I would like to achieve with this is to eventually add in, how should I put this, service restarts that I can schedule. I would like to be able to schedule maintenance shutdown, where it shuts down the server and does a backup and then restarts the server afterwards automatically. When these restarts and maintenance shutdowns occur, I would eventually like to have the server launcher post a message in chat, say 10 minutes before maintenance shutdown or 10 minutes before a server restart, warning that whoever is online that the server is about to shut down for scheduled maintenance or restart. Stuff like that. So there are quite a few things that I would eventually like to add to it. And this will effectively become the main handling class for all of the features for a specific Minecraft server that's being run at the moment. But we all start at the beginning, so let's see if we can get some stuff put into this one. We need to know where the server resides, so let's get a path. We also need to know the jar, so we also need to tell this class what jar we need to execute. Welcome back, Sky. And memory settings and all the other junk that we need to put in here. So let's get some properties to begin with. And of course, one thing that I would like to do on this particular class is to lock the properties so they cannot be changed while the server is running. One way to accomplish that is by setting an internal flag that determines whether this class instance is locked or not. It's similar to how you accomplish the is this object disposed or not. So first of all, I'll put in a private flag which determines whether this particular instance is locked. We will get back to this later. Actually, for now, we'll put in determines whether this instance is locked. If locked, properties cannot be changed while the server is running. Just a reference to ourselves. Alright, then we need a path to where the server resides. So let's get a actually let's do this for once. Var server path, set that to nothing. Do the old style property reference. The reason for doing it this way is to ensure that we can modify stuff internally if we need to, correctly ignore changes to the property if the server is running and thereby locked. And we can do some other stuff as well. This one just needs to return the server path, but this one needs to be a little bit different. If not locked, then we can do a quick check to see if the path that we're trying to assign to this property actually exists. So let's do that. And if it doesn't exist, we will ignore the property change. This again requires the system IO namespace. if this particular path exists, then we'll stuff it in here. MR server path equals value trim. And just to be on the safe side, we will check if this is greater than 0 and ensure that we actually have a trailing backslash. It's something that I prefer doing. It just makes it easier down the line to do a path and file name combination. Add a backslash to it, and there we go. Now, if this server host is currently locked, the change to the property will be ignored. Some would ask, why don't you just throw an exception of some kind? Honestly, I could do that, but that means I need to put all of these into a try catch in the main thread, which I really don't want to do. So for now, we'll just let it ignore whatever changes might be made to it. The same goes if we try to assign a path that doesn't exist. We could actually, just for the sake of argument, reset the current path value if an invalid path is assigned to it. And of course this will only happen as long as the server has not been started yet. So we're all good. Just for the sake of organizing it, again, personal preference. You don't have to do it this way. There we go. Determines the path to the Minecraft server. There we go. Put in some documentation. We also need to know the jar that needs to be executed. So let's get one of those, and we'll do something similar. Property we'll do the server jar. Yeah, that should be fine. String server jar, and again do the getter and the setter for it. If not locked, then we can do this. Now, here it would most likely be beneficial to make sure that the path has been set before the jar reference is set. So we'll check if the server path has a length greater than 0. If it doesn't, then we simply ignore it. Then we do a file exists on the server path plus the value that's being passed here, which would be the actual name of the Minecraft server jar. The reason we're doing this check is to ensure that the path and the jar actually do exist. So if they exist and we're not locked, then we'll store this setup. There we go. This effectively ensures that we cannot change these properties while the server is running. Whether it's something that we will actually need to do this way or not is something that we'll figure out in the future. jar. Uh, Minecraft server jar. There we go. Brain went derp. Let's collapse these. There we go. All right. Let's get a section for public methods as well. There we go. And we'll do a method that allows us to set both the path and the jar in one go. By doing this, you could say that it's kind of double work, creating both the property handling for it as well as doing a method for it. I like to have options. I like to have different ways that I can approach this particular setup. So for now, I'm leaving myself the open options of either using the method or setting the properties one at a time and then calling something to start up the server. Yep, I did get a smoke break. I went on a nature call about an hour ago. Anyways, let's see if we can come up with some kind of method to welcome back, Pinwheel. Well, we have had a we finished the configuration. We've well, we have a finished ini file class that can read and write ini files. We wrote up a profile config that can support more than one server profile, and we have actually had an instance of the Minecraft server running. So far we're doing pretty good. What I'm doing right now is I'm migrating the initial test code that I built. I would like to migrate this into a separate class that internally can run in a separate thread to host the actual Minecraft server running. So at the moment I'm building up a host class for it, adding the needed properties to it and such, and methods for starting up the server. Later on I'll add the thread that handles it, as well as miscellaneous different events. One of the things that I would like to add into this setup is something that looks through the output that comes from Java while running the server, looking for the final done message that the server outputs. Let's see if we can find something here. This particular line, see, it outputs current time of day, then the server thread /info level, and states done, and then how long it took. For help, type help or question mark. As part of the output handling, I want to implement something that looks for this particular line and then raises an event in the server host class that indicates the server is now done loading. When doing this for modded servers, I'm well aware that they often continue loading after the core of the server has finished loading. Some mods, they load up their specific dimensions, do some I don't know, initialization stuff there, and then possibly unloads them again, and so on and so forth. But when the done for help type help line occurs, that means the core of the server has completed its loading process, meaning all of the initialization is done and the server is literally ready for new player connections now. The reason I want to stuff that into an event is so that I down the line can put something in here that, for example, disables the start button right when you click at it, keeps it disabled, leaves the stop button disabled, and only enables the stop button once that particular one line has been caught by the output handler. I could also put up some red, yellow, and green icons on here indicating startup status of the server. We could do a lot of different things, but it's something that I want to put in there. Anyway, oh, we actually forgot one property. Let's see, that should probably be, let's see, P comes after J, so let's move that down here instead. There we go. And we also need to configure some amount of memory. This is particularly useful since a modded Minecraft server would use and need a lot more memory than a regular vanilla one would need. So it's kind of nice that we can set these up. Memory size. And we'll do the same here, except do this as an int and default this to 256 megabytes. I can't remember if Java 8 has a minimum of 256 or 512, but there is a minimum size. Anyway, let's get the property stuff out of the way here. There we go, set. And if this is not locked, then if value is greater than or equal to 256 and value less than, I can't remember if the maximum of Java is 8 gigs. Anyway, we'll do 84. To do later on, replace with this cups physical memory max. This is something that we can retrieve somewhere and figure out exactly how much physical memory is available. And we can put that in there as the maximum, letting the computer determine what the absolute maximum memory you can set aside is. Of course, that could potentially conflict with the amount of memory that the operating system needs to run, and so on and so forth, but that's what swap files are for. Anyhow, just to make sure that we don't go completely nuts, we'll do this for now. There we go. Alright. Determines the memory set aside for Java to run this Minecraft server instance. There we go. Alright. Now we've got that. Let's see if we can stuff a method in here that effectively accomplishes the same thing. So let's do a public method here called configure server. Why not? Public void. And first of all, we need a path. We also need the server jar, and we also need the memory size. Right. If we're not locked, will be true when the server is running. Right. Okay. Again, we'll do a check to see if the path exists. If it does, then we'll set the server path. And since I like having trailing backslashes on paths, I think I'm going to go up and do a quick method that effectively does this for us. Because we're going to need it in multiple different locations. So internal helper methods, and do a method called fixPath, private string. It needs to return a string, and there we go. Okay, so if this is greater than 0, and if the last character, whoops, doesn't equal a backslash, then return path plus a backslash. Job done. Just for the sake of, well, again, one of those heated debates online whether you should one-line things or not. Honestly, if you can one-line a statement, then I'm of the opinion do it. I know that certain development teams do not want to one-line things and require that the curly brackets are actually there. It's again one of those personal preference things. To me, this is just less convoluted, so you can do it or whichever. It's up to you. Ensures that the path has a trailing backslash. The path to fix returns the past path with a trailing backslash. There we go. Okay. So instead of doing this now, we shall simply do this instead. That takes care of all these. There we go. And again, down here, fix path, job done. And then let's see if server path plus the server jar passed here. If it exists, then set the server jar, nope, not the path, the jar, to this one. And finally, let's see if memory size is greater than or equals 256 and less than 16384. And then do the memory size equals this memory size. There we go. It would of course help if I remembered to type everything out. There we go. Oops. Alright. Configures the path, jar, and memory size for this server instance. There we go. The path to the Minecraft server. The file bytes to set aside for the Java instance. There we go. Okay. Well, so Pinwheel, one of the major differences between C# and C++ is effectively how you reference different items. In C#, let's see if we can find a good example. Yeah. In C#, for example, referencing a property on an object is done by just using a period, whereas in C++ you would use this notation instead. That's one of the major differences. Another major difference is that while C++ is object-oriented, it is in general less event-driven than C# is. Overall, C# is fully event-driven, just like any other Windows application is. And of course, in C++, you generally don't have the, how should I put this, core Windows libraries thrown into the mix by default, like you would have in C# using Visual Studio. Of course, you can still use Visual Studio to develop C++, not a problem, but you would specifically have to go and include the Windows WinForms libraries in your C++ project to be able to utilize the UI stuff that comes with Windows. So in those respects, they are a little bit different. But other than that, the general syntax for the languages are more or less the same, with the exception of how you appoint object structures, such as calling methods and referencing properties and such. One of the major benefits of using C or C++ is that you can make heavy use of pointers instead of having to rely on the .NET framework's internal memory handling, which means that for C++ and C applications you can write even faster performance-wise applications than you would be able to do in C#, though any of the .NET framework languages, despite all the heated debates, are pretty much the same in terms of performance. There is little to no difference in the actual execution performance between VB.NET and C#. And yes, I know this is a religious debate, but I've done some serious testing on these things, and there is little to no difference performance-wise between the two. Heck, there's a reason why all of the different .NET languages can actually be interwoven in a single project. So you could have one person doing, say, file I/O handling in VB.NET. You can have another one do thread handling in C#, merge those two things together, and still be able to compile it, even though you're actually using two different languages. Just something worth noting. Anyways, let's see. We now have the option to set up a host class. Well, it can be pretty cool if you're working in a large team with programmers that have different language experience or language preference. But overall, the way I see it, if you're doing a project, the only situation where you should mix different languages is if one language can outperform the other in some manner where it's important. Say, for example, doing things like DirectX or OpenGL. In such a situation, it would be beneficial writing up the actual handling of DirectX viewports and media in something like C++, because say C#, for example, wouldn't be nearly as efficient as doing it in C++. But that's why we have the option of creating dynamic link libraries. So you can build your main handlers in C++ and then use, say, C# to interface to them, and thereby have C++ act as a wrapper for your media interface. Anyways, let's see. We can now configure it. So next up, we should probably start adding some stuff to actually have it run. So let's get rid of this quick. We probably should. I know that I have already pre-initialized them, but as a good measure of doing things, I will do the same down here. Default this to 256, set the jar to nothing, and set the path to nothing. There we go. We also need to make sure that we are not locked. Alright. So, let's see. At some point we at least need a method to start up the server. So let's add that. Method start. Later on we will implement a method to stop the server. And we also need a couple of events and some other stuff in here. So let's see. We'll go up here and throw in a couple of events that we can hook. And we should probably also allow ourselves some way of identifying each individual server instance that is running, and this is thinking ahead in case we want to expand it to be able to run more than one instance at a time. One way we could do this is simply just assigning it some kind of numeric value, some kind of ID. So why not just do that? And for that we will do a ID. Or should we call it session ID? Nah. Instance ID? Nah, we'll just call it ID. There we go. Okay. And then let's do this just a read-only. Return. Ugh. ID. There we go. Holds the ID of this Minecraft server instance. And then we will require that an ID is assigned when it's instantiated. So there we go. The reason for this is to allow us to hook the events of each server host instance and point them at the same event handler in the main thread. Then we can use the ID to determine which one we're actually getting this event from. We could also just pass the entire server host object, but that is less efficient than just throwing an ID across. That way we have less data that we actually need to transfer between threads. So it's both a performance thing, but also a memory thing. Every time you pass an object from one method to another, whether it be across a thread or not, you are effectively passing a copy of that object, which means you will end up using more memory by passing objects back and forth constantly. And that eventually leads to memory bloating, and we all know where that leads. So, not a good thing to do. Anyway, let's get some events in here. Now, we could have an event that triggers the instant that the start method is called. We could have an event that triggers when we actually do the thread startup stuff, and so on and so forth. And we would end up having 6,000 events attempting to inform us of whatever we're doing right now. But for the sake of having some form of consistency in what's going on, we'll grab a few of them. Some of these events will be declared ahead of time before we actually have the code to implement the functionality, but it's just to give you an idea of where I would like to go with this. And of course, if anyone has any kind of suggestions or requests, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm definitely watching. Anyway, let's start by having an event that goes server starting. The reason for having this is to be able to signal, okay, we are now in the process of starting up the server. So we'll grab a delegate void event handler. Doesn't needs the server host ID, like this. Then we need the event. There we go, and then and for this we actually don't need to pass it because we already have it as a declared variable, so we'll just invoke this mrd. There we go. And since this is the only situation as such where you would get some kind of IntelliSense help, this is where I'm going to put the descriptive information for it. Triggers when the Minecraft server begins its startup process. There we go. Then we'll grab another one, which will be server started. And again, we need a delegate. There we go. And again, we'll signal the server host ID. And again, the event. There we go. And the internal reference to it, as well as the invoke ID. There we go. And the description for it triggers when the Minecraft server has completed its startup process. And just for personal reference or internal reference, this event will be raised once the output parser sees this line. And I do believe we have it somewhere here. Grab this as an example and stuff it in here in our nodes. There we go. Alright. In a similar fashion, we can also have the output parser look for the potentially these two lines stopping server. If we have it look for this, we can trigger server shutting down and or server closing, whatever we want to call the event. And in a similar fashion, we can also trigger an event just as the thread shuts down, which indicates the server has actually stopped now. So let's do that. Right, let's get another event in here. Server shutting down. We'll use that. We again need a delegate. Event handler. Server host ID. We need the event. There we go. And we also need some way of raising it. Void on. There we go. Again, we don't need the ID because we're just grabbing it from the property variable. There we go. And some kind of IntelliSense help triggers when the server starts shutting down. And finally, server stopped. Ugh. There we go. The event handler for it. Server host ID. And the event. There we go. And the method we use to actually raise the event. There we go. And a bit of description. Triggers when the server has stopped completely. There we go. Alright. There are a bunch of other things that we could put in here. One of them would be, for example, monitoring players joining and leaving. By doing that, we could maintain an internal list of who's currently online, so we can simply just ask this server host object who's online at the moment. Are there any players online? If we want to put up something like sending a private message from this application to that particular player, we could add something like that in there. Tons of different things that we can do. For now though, I think I'm going to add in one more event up here, which I will name console changed. There we go. Event handler. For this, we need a host ID. It would also be beneficial if we can appoint some kind of level. The reason for this is because if you look at a Forge mod loader enabled server loading up, then there can be different console log levels. Some of them are posted as debugs, some of them as error, some of them as warnings, and so on and so forth. So if we grab whatever's in here and split that, we can use the info that's currently listed here as the actual log level. So we will do a little bit of string splitting and throw that into the mix and effectively post that as a piece of information that this event can return. Now, if we don't hook this event in the main thread, then the information will just be ignored. So it's one of those, you can choose to use it or not. But we'll put it in here. We'll do a log level and log message. There we go. And then define the event and do the log level as well as the log message. There we go. And then we'll invoke this as needed with the current server host ID as well as the log level and the log message. There we go. Triggers every time the Minecraft server console changes. There we go. Oh, we haven't implemented any of this yet, but we will get there. Okay, at least now we have a bunch of events that we can eventually trigger as needed. Let's collapse these quick so we can get an overview. We have console changed, we have server starting, we have server started, we have server shutting down, and we have server stopped. In a similar fashion, let's get rid of this quick. Here we go. We also need to implement some methods so we can actually start and stop this thing. So let's get one in here, which would be the start. Now, this one we could potentially throw a result back that determines whether the start attempt was actually successful, which would effectively return true whenever the handler thread has fired up successfully, provided that the configured path, jar, and memory size are correct, which could allow us to start this up. So why don't we just do that? This is of course optional. We don't exactly have to grab the result from this method, but we can if we want to at some point. It's a nice thing to have. Alright, first of all, we need to make sure that we actually have a path. We also need to make sure that we have a jar configured. And we also need to make sure that we have a memory size configured. And since we're defaulting that to, no, we defaulted that to 256, so we'll just leave that for now. There we go. If these indicate that we may have the option to start it up, we'll see if we actually can find this particular jar. So let's give that a shot. If file exists, server path plus the server jar, then yep. both path and file exists. Let's do this. Alright. Okay, in here somewhere, it would be a good idea if we built up the actual thread handling for this. So let's do that here. Thread handling. Alright, we know that we're gonna need a method to properly handle this, but we also know that we need some kind of indicator that tells us whether this stuff is running or not. Luckily for us, we actually have most of the stuff sitting back here already, so we don't really need to worry too much about it, except basically copy the stuff from here over to the thread handler here. So let's grab a thread. We need the system threading namespace for that. Call it server thread. Set that to nothing. The reason I do that is to ensure that we don't have some random wildcard information sitting in there, which can actually happen. Microsoft doesn't give us any guarantees that when we create a variable that will host a thread, that it can't point to some discarded thread. So by initializing it to null, we are absolutely sure that there's no junk information in there. Alright, and we need a method to host it. And we'll call this run server. There we go. And that's pretty much it. So we know that the path is correct as well as the jar, so let's see if we can fire this up. Server thread, we'll start by locking the class. This prevents properties from being changed. And then we'll start a thread which points to run server. Alright. Then we need to server thread, new thread start, run server. Can't remember if we need these. Nope. There we go. Alright. Next up, we need to start it. So we'll do that. And just to monitor that the thread is actually starting up, we'll do a while the server thread is not alive, we'll do a simple thread sleep, which is basically a delay of 5 milliseconds. 5 milliseconds is 5/1000ths of a second, so it's not something that we feel all that much. And the reason for doing this is to ensure that you allow the thread to properly start up and properly start executing the code that's assigned to this particular thread. It's being courteous to make sure that everything is in working order. Now that this is done, we can then return true. In all other cases, we will return false. There we go. Attempt to start the Minecraft server. Boom. Okay, we still haven't triggered any events, so let's go and do that. We also need to put the execution code in here, so let's go over here and grab that quick. We've already done most of it, so just grab this, stuff it in here, And we need the diagnostics in there as well. There we go. This will need to change. However, the first thing that we need to do is actually raise the server starting event. So we shall do that. Since we don't need to specify the server host ID, because the method does it internally, we don't have to add the argument in there. Just saves a bit of typing. All right. Here we have the mbar memory size that takes care of the memory assignment, and we also have the Minecraft jar, which is now called server jar. There we go. We'll leave the GUI to pop up still, just while we're doing the test runs and such, just to allow us a little more access to stuff. We don't want a shell execute. We'll redirect input and output. We don't want it to create any extra console window. And the last bit we need to set is the server path. There we go. This then attempts to start up the process and keeps looping it for as long as output still comes from the process that we're running. Now, this is the actual spot in which we need to update the console changed event. But before we do that, we kind of need to see if we can do a little bit of text parsing. So that's something we will need to do here. This will need the log level, and this will need the log message, but since we don't have any of them yet, we'll just comment them out for now. Now, the last thing that we need to do before this thread finishes is to raise the server stopped event, which is done like this. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. All right. Let's have a look at this quick. We actually have one more event in here that we can trigger, which would be the on server started event. That's the one where we need to look for the done for help type help and such. So we'll grab that in here as well. We know that we need it, but we'll need to do a little bit of text parsing on this string before we do that. So let's start and see what we can do about these quick. I'll increase the font size a little bit. There we go. Let's go up to 12, 14. There we go. Okay. So this is a dump of the last run of the Minecraft server, and it throws out a bit of information for us. Now, this particular line is the one that we need to see so we can properly raise the server started event, and we also need to look for this line and potentially this line, so we can properly raise the server shutting down event. On top of that, we need to grab all of this information and split it into two separate parts, one of them being the info, which is the log level, and the rest of it will just put the entire message out as the actual log message. We could split this out even further and have the timestamp separately. We could have the whichever thread this particular message came from. In this instance, it's the Archon listener running, which runs in a separate thread. We could split out the log level and then have whatever's past the colon, meaning this, for example, in a separate message. But for now, we will just grab the actual log level, which will allow the main thread event handler to sort out which ones we actually want and which ones we don't care about. All right. We're coming up on 4 in the afternoon, so I think I'll treat myself to another nature break, and I will be back in a minute or so. And then we'll do all of the console text parsing. So I shall be right back.